We're now going to borrow our good friend the circle again, at least a new variation of it, but it's a circle with exception, and we're going to test it with another piece of code that we'll call test circle with exception. And in here, we're going to throw an exception if somebody tries to set a negative radius. And then we've got some code to test how that would work out. So let's create a new project, and we'll call this Java project test circle with exception. And I guess I'll want to type that again for the actual class name. So let's hit Control C on that. And now add a class by the same name to it. So we're going to do a new class, and the name will be the same, test circle with exception, but it's a class this time. And I suppose we're going to want a main method in there, so we'll check that box and click finished. And now that's all ready to go. But while we're at it, let's add our circle with exception class, because we're going to need that too. So let's make another new class and call it circle with exception. So we'll just get rid of test there, and that's ready to go now as well. So to save a little bit of time, let me just go ahead and copy and paste some appropriate code into here that I've got prepared for us already. So there's a number of errors, but that's because we haven't written the circle with exception class yet. Let's go ahead and again, I'm going to just copy and paste some pre-existing code into here, and then we'll go through and talk about the code and what it does, just to save ourselves some time. Okay, so this isn't the exact code we saw before for our circle, and in fact it's different even in that it does include the facility to throw an illegal argument exception, as it turns out, but there's other differences too, because for example it does not inherit from geometric object like we had before. So it's a sort of watered down version of the original circle with this addition that it can generate an exception. So the name of the class is circle with exception, as you see up here at the top. We've got a private member, it's a radius, and that's all we had. So you remember before we had a date created and a filled status and a color. Well, we're just going to get rid of all those, because all we're interested in right now is to illustrate what happens when an illegal radius is entered. We've got a measure of the number of objects that were created, initialized to 0, and every time we create a circle we're going to bump it up by 1. And the purpose of having this in our test program is simply to count the number of circles we make, so we have a record of how many actually got made, because we're going to attempt to make 3, but we're going to have an illegal radius in one of them, so we'll wind up never making all 3 of them, and this will help to count how many we actually made to help us understand when the error happened. Here's the constructor for our circle. It's simply it's the noarg constructor, and if we don't provide a radius, it assumes a default of 1. On the other hand, if we do provide a radius, that would be this constructor down here, then we go ahead and set that radius equal to whatever argument we were passed. In either case, number of objects on this statement will get bumped up by 1 if we're successful. If something went wrong while we tried the construction process, then we're never going to get to this line and we won't bump up the number of objects. But as long as we're successful, we will. And that happens regardless of which constructor gets executed, because if we do the noarg constructor, it's going to call the other constructor with the 1 argument, which means we're still going to do this constructor no matter what. And we will bump up the number of objects count as long as we successfully make it to the end of that constructor. Now let's look at the rest of the code. Well, we have a public double get radius. It's a getter for our radius data member, and we return radius when this is called. There's one to set the radius, and here is where all the meat and potatoes are. This is where we're going to exercise our knowledge of exceptions in this case. We'll come back to this because this is really the important part of this code. Let's continue and look at the rest of it and then come back and finish it off. So here's the rest of what we have. we have a get number of objects method, which simply returns the number of circles that had successfully been created. And finally, there's a find area method that returns radius squared times pi r squared, in other words, of the area of the circle. Okay, so all the kinds of usual things we'd expect to see in a circle object, but as I said, the important thing here is what is happening right here in this particular piece of code, because this is where we're dealing with exceptions. So what we do then is we declare public void set radius double new radius. Here's where we're giving the user the chance to set a new value of a radius, and we're not done yet because we declare this to throw an illegal argument exception. Again, what that means is it doesn't mean it throws it, but it means it could throw it because someone could give us a negative radius, which is illegal. I had to put that all on one line for clarity. I think that might make it a little bit more clear what this particular line of code is doing here. So this is the actual implementation then. We start by checking the radius to make sure it is a legal radius. In other words, it's greater than or equal to 0. And if it is, we simply go ahead and set the radius data member of our class to new radius. And that's it, and we're all done. Otherwise, it must be illegal. So the else part here says, if this is illegal, then instead of trying to go ahead and make the circle, I'm going to stop right here and now, and I'm going to throw an illegal argument exception. So we do that by saying throw new illegal argument exception with a string argument in its constructor. And again, I'm going to put this on one line because I think it does make it a bit clearer. With an argument of radius cannot be negative. And presumably when this particular exception is dealt with, it will print the message somehow radius cannot be negative as part of what it does. So that concludes a description of our circle with exception. Now let's look at the driver program for it. Okay, so in a try block, remember whenever you see a try block, you know that there's the potential for an exception to happen. There might not be any exceptions at all, but they could happen. That's why we have a try block. It basically means try to do this and see if any exceptions happen. As long as they don't, we just go through the try block and do the whole thing. However, as soon as an exception occurs, we bail out and try to catch it down below. Well, when we do our first circle, we create a circle called C1. So the object name is C1. It's of class circle with exception, and we create it to be a new circle with exception of radius 5. Well, that's a legal radius. There's no problem with that. So we should be successful. And incidentally, our number of objects count should pop up by 1 as a result, because after all, we've successfully created a circle, so that should increase from 0 to 1 to indicate that. We're trying to make 3 circles. We're not going to get that far as it turns out. In fact, as you can see here, the next line is going to be problematic. We tried to create a circle with radius -5, and of course that is going to generate our illegal argument exception. So this particular statement right here in the middle of our try block, it will throw an exception, and the type of exception it throws will be an illegal argument exception. Because an exception has been thrown, we will bail out and we will never get to do the rest of this try block. We'll find ourselves down at the catch block trying to catch an exception, and we will be able to because it turns out that the particular exception that got thrown was an illegal argument exception, and that's exactly the kind of argument we're expecting here. So we go ahead and we catch it. We call it XEX, and it's useful that we've actually given it a name because we're going to have to use it down below. Down below, all we do to process the exception is merely print a message that says, well, it does a toString on X actually, and in that context it will be the string that we passed our illegal argument exception during construction. So in other words, it'll be that string that said, well, let's go back and look at what it said. It actually said radius cannot be negative. So that will be what happens when you try to print the object EX, which is an object of class illegal argument exception. The toString function on that will in fact print the string that we constructed it with, so it will print that message, radius cannot be negative. And now the catch block is done. We've dealt with it appropriately, but we still don't get to go back to our try block. It's too late for that. We've bailed out, we're gone, and we're done the catch block, and now we just continue on with the rest of the program. The rest of the program happens to print out a string that says number of objects created, and then prints out the value, the static member of our circle with exception class, which is monitoring how many successful circles, or how many circles were successfully made. In our case, we only made one, so that's going to print out the number 1. So I've just explained how the code should work if the code works the way it should. So let's try it now and see what happens. So we're going to run it, and we come up with a java.lang.illegal argument and there's our string, radius cannot be negative. And then, so we've sort of dealt with the exception, but we haven't crashed. We then go on to continue and we do the rest of our program, and the rest of our program simply prints out number of objects created 1, showing that in fact, even though we attempted to make 3 circles, we only got as far as making 1. When we attempted to make the second circle, the exception happened and we bailed out and we didn't make any more circles. So our final tally of the number of circles was just going to be the 1. So that's a very nice example, putting together some stuff we're familiar with, the circle object, in conjunction with this new stuff we're learning about try catch blocks and exceptions.